A man in a dark coat walks the banks of the Delaware River, watching his gardeners set young trees in the ground. The estate is his. He has named it Point Breeze. His neighbours know him as the Count de Survilliers, a wealthy Frenchman with one of the finest art collections in New Jersey. A few years earlier, he had been King of Spain. Soon, men would cross an ocean to offer him another crown, this time in the Americas. On the 20th of April 1814, in the courtyard of the palace at Fontainebleau, Napoleon said his farewells to the soldiers of his guard and climbed into a carriage for the coast. Ahead of him lay the small Mediterranean island of Elba, handed to him as a miniature kingdom by the powers that had just beaten him. Behind him, he left a wife, a son, a mother, 4 brothers, 3 sisters, and the wreckage of the largest European empire anyone had seen since Charlemagne. The empire was finished. The family was not, and what would become of it had no obvious answer. The eldest of them was the man who would end up planting trees on the Delaware. Joseph Bonaparte had reigned in Madrid as King of Spain. As the Allied armies closed on Paris, he escorted the Empress out of the city, then slipped toward the Swiss border, burying papers and diamonds in the ground along the way. He bought a chateau on Lake Geneva and waited. Within 2 years, he would cross the Atlantic to that wooded riverbank in New Jersey. He travelled under a borrowed title, carrying enough of the family fortune to live out his life as one of the wealthiest men in the United States. He was the first of them to land on his feet, and the clearest early sign of how the rest would survive what was coming. For most of 2 decades, Napoleon had governed Europe partly through his relations. He had made Joseph a king twice over, first in Naples and then in Spain. He had put one brother on the throne of Holland and a third on a new throne carved out of Germany. His sisters had been handed duchies and a kingdom. His brothers-in-law made princes. His stepson set up as viceroy of Italy. It was government by household, and when the head of the household fell, every one of these arrangements fell with him. In a single spring, 8 people who had been royalty woke up as fugitives. What made it cruel was the speed of it. The powers gathering at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map of Europe treated the scattering of the Bonapartes as routine housekeeping. The family was not to be allowed to settle together anywhere it might grow into a centre of intrigue. The Austrian Chancellor, who shaped that peace more than any other man, wanted them watched, separated, and slowly forgotten. For the most part, he got what he wanted. That the family woke up wealthy was not an accident. Before he left Fontainebleau, Napoleon did what a careful head of a family does when he senses the end. He arranged payments, 1,000,000 francs to one, 300,000 to another, to his brothers, his sisters, and his mother. It was the last great handout of imperial money before the treasury passed into other hands. The Bonapartes would lose their thrones in 1814, and again for good the following year. The victors could bar the family from the throne. What they could not touch were the things that actually carry a dynasty: its money, its marriages, and its half-forgotten younger branches, and the Bonapartes still had all 3. Where they went said everything about their place in the new Europe. The brothers scattered, one to Rome under the protection of the Pope, one drifting through Switzerland and Italy, the youngest sheltering inside the Austrian Empire. The sisters and their mother went south, toward Rome and Trieste. France itself was closed to them. The restored Bourbon kings, back on the throne their own family had lost in the Revolution, had no wish to share the country with the dynasty that had replaced them. When Napoleon returned from Elba in 1815 for the brief campaign that ended at Waterloo, he hardened every fear the victors held. Within a year of his final fall, a new law banished the whole Bonaparte family from France in perpetuity. No member could own property there or set foot on French soil, and the ban reached down to descendants not yet born. Napoleon himself was sent far beyond Elba, to the Atlantic rock of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. For a family whose claim rested on having ruled France, being written out of the country cut deeper than the loss of any throne, and so they went looking for somewhere else to be. In a tall house near the centre of Rome, An old woman in black received reports on her scattered children the way other people read the morning papers. Letizia Bonaparte had borne 13 children and buried 5 of them young. The 8 who lived had given her a son who ruled a continent and daughters who wore crowns. Now she sat at the heart of the Catholic city while every one of those crowns was stripped away. Romans called her Madame Mère, Madame Mother. She had grown up poor on Corsica and had never quite believed the grandeur would last. So when it went, she did the practical thing. She guarded the money, and she kept her scattered children in one another's letters, holding together by correspondence a family that no longer had a country to meet in. Rome took the exiled Bonapartes in when the kings of Europe would not. The Pope had been Napoleon's prisoner for years, dragged across the Alps and held in France against his will, and he answered that treatment by opening his city to the family that had ordered it. Letizia's half-brother, a cardinal, gave her a household there. Her brothers and her daughters sheltered nearby at different times. The city the emperor had once stripped of its lands became the safest address his relations could find. There were no French police in Rome, no Bourbon court watching the door, only an old pope with reasons of his own to be kind to them. They were safe here, but they were never quite free. The first generation thinned quickly, and it thinned in comfort. The eldest sister, who had governed Tuscany for her brother, died near Trieste in 1820. Within 5 years, the great beauty of the family was gone too, not yet 45. She had been the only sibling to stand by Napoleon to the end, selling her jewels to fund his exile. The buyer of her Paris townhouse was the Duke of Wellington, the man who would soon defeat her brother at Waterloo. The others faded more slowly. A widowed sister lived out her years under an assumed name. One brother kept a small court in Rome, another wrote poetry in Italy. One by one, the people who had worn the crowns settled into a long, comfortable, powerless obscurity. That safety came with eyes on it. Austrian and French agents read the family's letters, counted their visitors, and reported every rumor of a plot to capitals that had not stopped fearing the name. Their children grew up between languages and countries, introducing themselves by titles that matched no throne on the map. These were people who had commanded a continent, now filling their days with pensions, passports, and careful politeness to the governments that tolerated them. Even Letizia kept her accounts like a Corsican farmwife, having learned twice over that thrones vanish in an afternoon and only money stays loyal. The brother who managed it best was the one who had gone furthest away. Joseph Bonaparte, once King of Spain, crossed the Atlantic and built a country estate on the New Jersey bank of the Delaware, the wooded riverbank where this story began. He called it Point Breeze. He filled it with paintings by Rubens and Rembrandt, laid out gardens and an artificial lake, and kept a table that drew the Marquis de Lafayette and the most powerful men of the young republic. Within a few years, a startling proposal crossed the Atlantic to find him. There was talk, never firmly pinned down, of crowning a Bonaparte king of an independent Mexico, and the men behind it had come to the brother who had already lost 2 thrones. He turned them down. He had been a king twice, and twice it had ended in flight. What he held now was different. The pictures, the river, and the money working quietly in banks in London and Holland. None of it could be taken from him by a change of government in Europe. He had understood, sooner than most of his family, that a fortune outlasts a crown. Back in Rome, the matriarch outlived most of what she had built. Letizia learned of her son the emperor's death on his Atlantic rock in 1821, news that took 2 months to reach her. She buried 2 of her daughters before her own end. She lost her sight, kept to her house, and when she died in 1836, she was 85, the last great presence of the imperial generation. By then, the family had done something the victors of 1815 had never planned for. It had not been destroyed. It had only been put away, scattered across Italy and America, living on money the powers had failed to seize, waiting without quite knowing what it was waiting for. Whether the name would ever mean anything again was an open question. The answer was already growing up in a palace outside Vienna, and in a second boy, in exile, that almost nobody thought worth watching. In a palace on the edge of Vienna, a fair-haired boy was being raised to forget who his father was. He spoke German, not French. The court that surrounded him called him Franz, an Austrian archduke's name, and gave him an Austrian title, Duke of Reichstadt. The grand rooms of Schönbrunn were his home, and, in a quieter sense, his cage. The boy had been born with another name entirely, and a claim to the throne of France. At his birth in 1811, he had been hailed across an empire as the King of Rome, the long-awaited heir who would carry his father's work into another century. He was the son of Napoleon, and his grandfather, the Emperor of Austria, intended that he should never be allowed to remember it. His mother had made that easier than it should have been. Marie-Louise was a Habsburg archduchess, married to Napoleon in 1810 to seal a peace and to give him the son his first wife never had. When the empire fell, she did not follow her husband into exile. Her father took her home and gave her the small Italian duchy of Parma to rule. With her, he sent an Austrian general, the one-eyed Count Neipperg, to keep her company and steer her away from any thought of joining Napoleon. The plan worked completely. She bore Neipperg children while Napoleon still lived, married him after the emperor died, and married a third time after that. The wife of the greatest conqueror of the age chose Parma, quiet government, and a life far away from St. Helena. She died in 1847, still ruling her small Italian duchy. She was laid to rest in Vienna among the Habsburg emperors. Her years as Empress of the French shrunk to a single line in a much older family story. The boy left behind in Vienna grew up clever, restless, and increasingly aware of exactly who he was. He read about his father in secret. He kept the man's portrait and asked the old soldiers he could reach what the conqueror had really been like. He trained as a soldier himself and longed for a command. But the Austrian court had no use for a living symbol of Bonapartism, and so the Duke of Reichstadt was kept close, watched, and given nothing to do. His health failed him before his ambition could. He fell ill with tuberculosis, the slow, consuming disease of the century. On the 22nd of July, 1832, he died in the palace of Schönbrunn, in a room not far from where his father had once slept as a conqueror passing through. He was 21 years old, and he left no child. With him, the direct line of descent from Napoleon to a son simply stopped. In his short life, the boy had become a king of legend, the lost Eaglet that French Bonapartists dreamed would one day fly home to Paris. Poets wrote about him. Plotters used his name in schemes he knew nothing about. He himself lived walled inside an Austrian routine of drills, lessons, and careful supervision. He was an officer in his grandfather's army, holding the ghost of a French crown he was never once allowed to reach for. When his lungs began to fail, the court physicians could do nothing, and his mother travelled up from Parma in time to sit beside him at the end. He had spent his whole life as the most closely guarded prince in Europe, and he died having ruled nothing at all. For a watching world, that should have been the end of the Napoleonic story. The emperor was 11 years in his grave. His only legitimate son was now in his, at 21, having ruled nothing and married no one. The brothers were aging exiles scattered across Italy and America. The sisters were nearly all dead. The Allied powers who had crushed the empire in 1815 had every reason to believe the file was closed, the name spent, the danger past. They were wrong, and wrong in a way no one had thought to guard against. The family was not finished. It had only been waiting in the wrong branch. What they had not counted on was the daughter's line and the younger nephews. Louis, the former King of Holland, had married Hortense de Beauharnais, the daughter Josephine had brought to her marriage with Napoleon. Their third son had been born in Paris in 1808 and carried both bloodlines, Bonaparte through his father and Beauharnais through his mother. His name was Louis-Napoléon. He had grown up in exile in Switzerland and Germany, watching his uncle's legend swell in the years after Waterloo. From the death of the Duke of Reichstadt, he drew a conclusion that nobody in Vienna or Paris took seriously. If the direct heir was gone, then the claim was his. He was, at first, easy to dismiss. He tried to raise a garrison against the French king at Strasbourg in 1836 and was bundled out of the country. He tried again at Boulogne in 1840, landing with a few dozen followers and a tame eagle meant to evoke his uncle. He was arrested and locked in a fortress for what was meant to be life. He escaped after 6 years by walking out dressed as a labourer, a plank balanced on his shoulder. To the governments of Europe, he was a comic figure, a pretender with a famous surname and no army. They were wrong about him in the way people are wrong about a man whose moment has not yet come. On the night of the 2nd of December 1851, soldiers moved through Paris, arresting the men who might have stopped what was coming. At the centre of it was the once comic pretender, now President of the French Republic. After the Revolution of 1848 swept away France's last king, Louis-Napoléon was allowed home. He stood for the presidency and won by millions, on the strength of one thing, his name, and the glory voters still attached to it. Now, barred by the Constitution from standing again, he took the rest by force. He waited a year, then made the change permanent. On the 2nd of December 1852, the anniversary of his uncle's victory at Austerlitz and of his own coup the year before, he proclaimed the empire restored and took the throne as Napoleon III. He put the decision to a national vote, and the official result gave him the overwhelming approval he needed. 37 years after the family had been barred from France by law, a Bonaparte ruled the country again. It had come back exactly as it had survived, not through the heir everyone had watched, but through a nephew from a branch the powers had written off. The Second Empire lasted 18 years, and for a while it shone. Napoleon III rebuilt Paris into the city of boulevards the world still visits, and married a Spanish countess named Eugénie. In 1856 he produced what his uncle's line had lacked, a healthy son and heir, known to France as the Prince Imperial. For the first time in 2 generations, the Bonapartes had a throne and a clear successor at the same time. Then, in 1870, the emperor let himself be drawn into a war against Prussia that France was not ready to fight. At the town of Sedan that September, he was surrounded and taken prisoner with his army. The empire fell in an afternoon. The family went into exile once more, this time to England, and Napoleon III died there in 1873. That left the boy. The Prince Imperial grew up in Kent and trained at the British Military Academy at Woolwich. He ached to prove himself worthy of his name in the only way his family had ever truly respected, under fire. When Britain went to war against the Zulu kingdom in southern Africa in 1879, he begged to go. The British government refused, then gave way under pressure from the Queen herself. He sailed to Africa as an observer attached to the British Army. A bitter symmetry ran through it. The heir to the Napoleonic name had grown up in England, sheltered by the country that had been his great-uncle's most stubborn enemy. Now he went to war in its uniform. The boy who might have been the 4th Napoleon had learned his soldiering from the army of Waterloo. On the 1st of June 1879, the heir to Napoleon's empire died in a British uniform in the grasslands of southern Africa, thousands of miles from the France he was meant to rule. He had been out on a small scouting patrol in Zululand when his party was ambushed. He was 23. His body was brought back not to Paris but to England, and buried in an abbey in Hampshire that his mother built to hold him. The dream of putting another Napoleon on the French throne had survived Waterloo and clawed its way back once already. It ended for good on a scouting patrol in the African veldt. His death took more than a life. The Bonapartist movement in France had rested everything on him, a young, able, popular heir who might one day have been called home the way his uncle and his father had been called home. With him gone, there was no figure left to gather behind. The idea of a third Napoleon ruling France faded out quietly in the years after 1879, until it belonged to history rather than to politics. His mother outlived all of it. Eugénie, the last empress of the French, lived on in England for more than 40 years after her son's death. For most of those years, she was the dynasty itself, its memory and its dignity. Pretenders, politicians and crowned heads called on her in England to pay respects to a cause that no longer had a throne, and the British royal family treated her almost as one of their own. The Bonaparte name survived those decades not in a palace, but in the drawing room of the widow the empire had left behind. She died in 1920 at the age of 94, having seen the family rise, rule, fall, and lose its heir. The imperial claim passed sideways to the descendants of Jérôme, the youngest brother. He had sheltered in Austria in 1814 and lived, alone of all the siblings, to see his nephew restore the empire before dying full of honours in 1860. Through that line, the family has continued to this day. And the family has not quite let go. In October 2019, the current head of the House of Bonaparte was married in Paris, in the Church of les Invalides, the same complex beneath whose great dome Napoleon himself lies. He is Jean-Christophe Napoleon, a great-great-great-grandnephew of the Emperor, born in 1986. His bride was an Austrian countess, a great-granddaughter of the last Emperor and Empress of Austria-Hungary, and a descendant of the very Habsburg house Napoleon had married into in 1810. 2 centuries after the empire fell, a Bonaparte and a Habsburg were joined again, only a few steps from the tomb of the man who had begun it all. The Bonapartes lost the throne in 1815, won it back in 40 years, and lost their last real hope, not to Europe's great powers, but to a scouting party half a world away. Thanks for watching. Napoleon's son was raised by the Habsburgs at Schönbrunn, the same dynasty that would lose an empire of its own a century later. To see how, watch next our video about what happened to the Habsburgs after their empire collapsed. Please like and subscribe, and let us know which story to cover next.